The history of the transatlantic slave trade holds within it tales of unimaginable human suffering, complex intersections of economics, religion, and geopolitics, and the harsh realities of a world shaped by both conquest and resistance. The slave ship Jesus serves as a stark symbol of these contradictions, a vessel that sailed under the banner of the Christian faith while being complicit in the trade of human lives. The name alone evokes a powerful dissonance between the ship's spiritual connotation and its grim purpose. This story seeks to explore the life and journeys of this ship, examining its origins, voyages, the lives it touched, and the echoes it left behind in history. The transatlantic slave trade emerged as European nations vied for dominance across the seas, propelled by a thirst for wealth and power. This era was marked by an aggressive push for exploration and colonization, along with the establishment of lucrative trade routes. Within this wave of imperial ambition, religious motivations were often interwoven, adding a complex layer to the pursuit of conquest. Ships that sailed under Christian emblems carried with them a supposed duty to spread faith, yet they also bore chains, weapons, and the seeds of bondage. Among these vessels, the slave ship Jesus epitomized this fusion of religious justification and brutal economic pursuits. Its voyages were defined by exploitation, greed, and profound human cost, leaving an enduring scar on history's conscience. When the Jesus finally reached the shores of the New World, the captives emerged blinking into the harsh light, weakened but alive. The long weeks spent in the bowels of the ship, marked by darkness, suffocating air, and relentless despair, gave way to a reality no less cruel. The enslaved were herded off the ship, their limbs stiff from confinement, their eyes adjusting to the brightness and unfamiliar landscape. Each step off the gangplank marked a transition from one form of bondage to another. The captives were paraded before potential buyers in an open market, an ordeal as dehumanizing as the journey itself. Stripped of any remnants of dignity, they stood exposed while merchants and plantation owners scrutinized them with cold, calculating eyes. Their bodies were inspected like livestock, buyers probing their muscles, checking their teeth, and assessing their overall health and strength. These examinations determined their worth not as human beings, but as labor units, a chilling reduction of identity to physical productivity. In the humid air of the marketplace, the cries of auctioneers echoed as they touted the quality and endurance of the enslaved. The cacophony of voices mixed with the muffled weeping of those who realized they were about to be separated from family members and compatriots. Mothers clung desperately to their children, only to be pried apart by rough hands, their protests ignored or met with violence. The psychological torment of these forced separations was profound, severing ties that had already been tested to the breaking point by the Middle Passage. Once sold, the newly enslaved were often branded with the insignia of their new owners, a mark of possession that further stripped them of their humanity. The branded flesh was a stark reminder of their altered status, no longer free individuals, but commodities within a system of relentless exploitation. This branding, like the shackles they had worn on the ship, was a visible symbol of the unyielding control imposed upon them. The environments they were thrust into varied depending on their purchases. Some were sent to vast sugar plantations where backbreaking labor from dawn to dusk became the routine. Others found themselves working in tobacco fields, cotton plantations, or mines, each environment marked by its own brutal conditions. Overseers, who were often ruthless in maintaining order, wielded whips and other instruments of punishment without hesitation. The slightest sign of resistance or perceived inefficiency was met with swift and often lethal consequences. Colonial societies that benefited from the labor of the enslaved held varying degrees of complicity. Plantation owners justified their participation in the slave economy through economic arguments, claiming that their wealth and the prosperity of their colonies depended on such labor. Religious justifications also played a role, with some clergy preaching that Africans were divinely ordained to servitude. These doctrines painted a veneer of moral legitimacy over the stark reality of cruelty, allowing those who profited from slavery to assuage their conscience. For the enslaved, the New World was a place of relentless toil and violence, but also of quiet, determined resistance. Despite overwhelming oppression, many sought to preserve their cultural identities through song, language, and clandestine gatherings. Songs sung in the fields carried hidden meanings, acting as messages of hope, solidarity, or covert plans. The retention of these cultural practices was an assertion of selfhood in an existence that sought to erase their humanity. There were also overt acts of defiance. Some enslaved individuals attempted escape, risking severe punishment or death in their quest for freedom. Maroon communities, settlements formed by escaped slaves, sprang up in isolated areas, embodying the spirit of resistance and self-preservation. These communities became symbols of defiance against an oppressive system, showing that even in the most dire circumstances, the human spirit could strive for autonomy. Those who could not escape had to find ways to survive under the constant threat of violence. The plantation system was designed to crush hope, with overseers instilling fear through public punishments that served as warnings to others. The whip cracked across the backs of the disobedient, while stocks and iron collars stood as reminders that rebellion had dire consequences. Yet, in the face of such cruelty, subtle forms of rebellion persisted. Work slowdowns, feigned illness, and sabotage of equipment were quiet acts that allowed enslaved people to reclaim small measures of control over their lives. The wealth generated from these plantations flowed back to Europe, enriching the crown and the investors who had funded expeditions like those of Sir John Hawkins. The raw materials harvested by enslaved hands fueled the growth of industries and financed the expansion of cities, laying the economic foundation for modern Europe. Yet, the profits were tainted, built upon the suffering of countless individuals whose voices had been silenced. In the colonial ports where the Jesus and other slave ships docked, the sight of the newly arrived captives was commonplace. Ships laden with human cargo became symbols of a mercantile system that prized profit over compassion. Some colonists viewed these ships with a pragmatic eye, recognizing them as the source of their prosperity. Others, though fewer, questioned the moral implications of their society's dependence on human suffering. These voices, often drowned out by the clamor of commerce, would later contribute to the growing abolitionist movement. The enslaved who disembarked from the Jesus faced a daunting future, where each day was a struggle for survival. Despite the odds, many carved out spaces of resilience within the harsh conditions. They forged kinship bonds with fellow laborers, creating surrogate families that offered emotional support and a semblance of stability. Spiritual practices evolved, blending African traditions with the influences they encountered in the New World, giving rise to rich cultural expressions that persisted despite attempts to suppress them. As time passed, the arrival of slave ships like the Jesus became embedded in the collective memory of both the oppressed and their oppressors. For those who endured, the names of such ships became synonymous with the profound suffering they experienced. Yet, even in the depths of that suffering, the capacity for hope, resilience, and eventual resistance endured, a testament to the unyielding strength of the human spirit. The colonial world continued to extract wealth from the labor of the enslaved, but alongside this extraction grew the seeds of dissent. Among the whispers of resistance and survival, the call for freedom began to take root, fostering a sense of collective consciousness among those who toiled under oppression. The transformation of hardship into quiet defiance marked an important evolution in the enslaved community's struggle for identity and autonomy. Although the auction blocks and plantations were designed to strip individuals of their sense of self, acts of cultural retention and unity among the enslaved showed that their spirit could not be wholly subjugated. The Maroon communities that formed in isolated regions became bastions of hope, places where escaped individuals could rebuild lives centered around freedom, however fragile. These enclaves of resistance reminded the larger world that, despite the shackles and the violence, an unquenchable thirst for freedom existed. The oppressive system relied on the enforced silence of its victims, but stories, songs, and oral histories kept alive the truths that could not be spoken openly. Among the enslaved, these stories offered both a reminder of who they were and a path forward, even when hope seemed unattainable. The haunting melodies sung in fields spoke of yearning for liberation and the memory of life before captivity. For the enslaved, these expressions were acts of defiance, preserving humanity in an existence designed to deny it. The legacy of these songs and stories transcended generations, carrying the spirit of resilience far beyond the plantations and into the future struggles for freedom. Colonial power structures viewed the enslaved as mere instruments of profit, but within the hearts and minds of those who endured, there was an unyielding resistance. For many, the bonds of kinship forged in the most dire circumstances offered solace and a shared purpose. Surrogate families became essential to survival, providing emotional sustenance and a means to resist the erasure of their identities. Even as the branding irons seared flesh and overseers cracked whips, the inner resolve of those enslaved endured, undeterred by the systemic cruelty surrounding them. The arrival of ships like the Jesus represented more than a transfer of human cargo, it symbolized the stark embodiment of a mercantile system that valued profit over humanity. These ships became grim harbingers of suffering, where human lives were reduced to commodities fueling the wealth of distant lands. Their presence in colonial ports was a chilling testament to the brutal mechanics of an economic empire built on the backs of the enslaved. The very sight of these vessels, with their holds emptied of captives, reinforced the daily reality of exploitation and reminded both colonists and the enslaved of the unrelenting grip of bondage. Yet, in that same grim context, seeds of resistance were planted, seeds that would grow into movements that challenged the foundations of the oppressive system, hinting at an eventual reckoning.